The third relay station stopped. Answering on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had just filed the weekly grain shipment report for the Kelfhari colony on Versh Prime, and I always filed grain reports on Tuesdays. 412 years of Tuesdays, 412 years of reports filed, received, acknowledged. The system worked because we made it work. We were patient people. We understood that civilization was not a thing that happened, it was a thing you maintained carefully every single Tuesday without exception. The station did not answer. I noted it in the log, equipment fault. Probable. I flagged it for the maintenance division and moved on to the next report, port tariffs on El Hari station. I had 17 of them to process before the end of the cycle. I processed all 17. My name is Esrath, and I am 431 years old, which among my people makes me relatively young. The Kelfhari do not rush. We were not built for rushing. Our hearts beat 11 times per minute. Our thoughts arrive fully formed, like stones settling into riverbed, slow and permanent and correct. We have a word in our language, Vethela, which translates roughly as the virtue of unhurried certainty. It is considered our highest cultural value. We built an interstellar civilization on it. We filed reports, we attended councils. We measured things carefully and wrote down what we found and trusted that the system of communication we had spent 3,000 years constructing would carry our words to where they needed to go. The second relay station stopped. Answering the following morning. I flagged it, logged it, sent a priority notice to the Communications Maintenance Bureau. The Bureau had a response time of 4 to 6 standard days, which was perfectly acceptable. These things happened. Equipment aged, solar interference corrupted signals. There were explanations for silence, and the explanations were always mundane, and the mundane always turned out to be true. That was what I believed. That was what 431 years had taught me. I went back to my desk. I had a report on water filtration system upgrades for the Kelfhari outpost on Mevron that needed cross-referencing with the budget allocation from the previous fiscal cycle, and I wanted to have it finished before the afternoon council meeting. I never made it to the council meeting. The window behind my desk faces east, toward the mountains that border the capital. I had looked at those mountains every working day for 63 years. I knew exactly what the morning light looked like on them. I knew the color of the rock at noon, and the way the shadows fell in the evening, and the particular shade of deep blue they turned in the last hour before the city's lights came on. I was cross-referencing water filtration budgets when the mountains turned orange. Not the orange of a sunrise, not any orange I had a word for. I looked at the window for a long time. Then I picked up my pen and wrote the date at the top of the next page of the report. I do not know why I did that. The report did not matter anymore. I think my hands did not yet know what my eyes were beginning to understand. My hands were still on a Tuesday, still filing, still maintaining the system. My eyes were somewhere else entirely. The city alarm came 40 seconds later. Sound I had heard in drills, but never in reality. A sound designed to reach into the oldest part of the brain, the part that remembered what it was to be prey, and wake it up. My brain was 431 years old. It had no such part, or so I had believed. I stood up from my desk, the water filtration report sat open, the budget figures neatly cross-referenced in 2 columns, the date written at the top of the next page in my careful, unhurried handwriting. I left it there. The streets outside were full of people who did not know which direction to move. The Kelvhari are not a panicking species. We do not run, we deliberate. But deliberation requires information, and information requires the relay stations, and the relay stations were not answering, had not been answering. And now the sky to the east was the wrong color and getting more wrong by the second, and nobody had a report for this. Nobody had filed the correct forms. Nobody had cross-referenced the right budget allocations to prepare us for the thing that was happening. I found my deputy, a younger Kelvhari named Orvesh, standing outside the administrative building with a data tablet in his hands, staring at the sky. I asked him what the emergency protocol required. He looked at me. He was only 180 years old, young enough that the alarm had reached something in him that it had not reached in me. His hands were shaking, which I had never seen a Kelvhari's hands do before. He said the protocol required us to reach the Central Coordination Office and await instructions from the planetary governor. I said, good, let us do that. We walked. I want to be clear about that. We walked because the Kelvhari walk, because we have always walked, because there is Vethel in the unhurried pace of a person who knows where they are going and goes there with intention. We walked while the sky to the east burned orange and then red and then color I still do not have a word for. Color that felt less like a color and more like an ending. The coordination office was full of people holding tablets and talking over each other, which was the closest the Kelphar come to chaos. Someone had gotten a partial signal from the eastern sector. Someone else was trying to reach the planetary governor's compound and getting no response. A third person was pulling up satellite imagery that loaded slowly, 1 pixel row at a time, like a curtain being drawn up over something that everyone in the room was beginning to suspect they did not want to see. I sat down at an empty console. I opened the interstellar communications array. I began composing a distress signal to every treaty signatory in the galactic compact. My hands were steady, this I can say with certainty. This I am not reconstructing from pride or from the comfortable distance of hindsight. My hands were steady because I had been trained for administrative function across 4 centuries of service, and administrative function does not stop because the window has turned the wrong color. You assess the situation, you identify the correct procedure, you execute it without hesitation. The signal went out to 31 species, 31 civilizations, 31 governments, 31 sets of ambassadors who had signed the Compact Mutual Defense Agreement 17 years prior in a ceremony on the neutral station at Havel's Point, where the wine was excellent and the speeches were long, and everyone smiled for the cameras and signed the documents and went home, satisfied that the galaxy was a safer place. I sent the signal. Then I went back to the console and tried again to reach the Eastern Relay Station. Still nothing. I tried Varish Prime. Nothing. I tried the Mevrin Outpost, the one with the water filtration report I had been cross-referencing when everything changed. The line was open. I could hear the connection. I said the outpost. Identification code. Waited for the duty officer to respond. No one responded. The line was open and no one responded. And I sat there with the receiver in my hand for a very long time. And GT snorts. And GT, listening to the particular quality of silence that exists on the other side of a connection that is working perfectly and reaching nothing. I filed the report anyway. Someone would answer. Someone always answered. Orvish found me at the console 2 hours later. The satellite imagery had finished loading. He did not show me what it contained. He looked at my face. First, the way young people look at the faces of older people when they need to know how scared to be, and then he sat down next to me and put the tablet face down on the desk. He said the evacuation ships were being prepared. I said good. He said there were 4,000 people at the capital's loading zone and more coming from the outer districts. He said the ships could hold them all if we left. Within the hour, he said the governor's compound had not responded to any communication in 3 hours. I said I understood. He asked me what we should do. I was 431 years old. I had spent my entire adult life in administrative service to the Kelfhari government. I had processed approximately 9 million reports, give or take the ones I had filed in the last few hours that would never be received by anyone. I had attended 4,000 council meetings. I had cross-referenced more budget allocations than I could count, managed more interdepartmental disputes than anyone deserved, and sat through 17 separate reviews of the water filtration upgrade program on Mevron. I told him we should go to the ships. He nodded. We walked, still walking even then. The eastern sky followed us all the way to the loading zone, and its color had changed again, and this time it was the color of something being erased. I boarded the last ship at the back of the line. I did not look behind me. I wanted to. I had 63 years of mornings with those mountains, and I wanted to look at them one more time. I told myself there was nothing to see. I told myself the view behind me was information I did not need and could not use. I told myself many things. The ship's door closed. I found a seat near the front of the passenger bay. The seat was slightly too small, designed for faster metabolizing species, which meant my knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat back in front of me. I sat in this uncomfortable seat for a long time as the engines came up and the ship lifted and the loading zone fell away beneath us. Orvesh sat next to me. After a while he asked if I was all right. I told him I had left a report unfinished on my desk. He looked at me for a moment and then he said nothing because there was nothing to say, and the Kelfhari understand silence better than any other species in the known galaxy. The ship broke atmosphere below us through the small round window. Beside my seat I could see the continent from above. I could see the capital. I could see the eastern mountains, and I could see what was happening to them, and I will not describe it here because some things do not need to be in any report. Some things should simply be acknowledged to have occurred and then left alone. I turned away from the window. The communications console at the front of the passenger bay was showing incoming data from the Galactic Compact Relay Network. Responses to my distress signal were already beginning to arrive. 31 species, 31 signatories, 17 years of smiling in photographs and shaking hands. Across a table on a neutral station, where the wine was excellent. The first response was from the Drell Consortium. It offered to dispatch a mediation team to open diplomatic dialogue with the Vihorn and negotiate a ceasefire. The second was from the Shanhari Collective. It expressed profound sorrow at our circumstances and assured us that the Shanhari people would hold the Kelvhari in their thoughts and prayers. The third was from the Udari Mercantile Alliance. It requested clarification through official channels regarding the current territorial and legal status of Kelvhari colony worlds given the evolving situation, and noted that its legal team was available for consultation. I read each response carefully. I read them all. At the bottom of the queue, between the Shanhari prayers and a formal expression of concern from the Pelhari governance assembly, was a response from the Ter. Compact. 2 words. Stand by. I read it 3 times. Then the ship entered the upper transit corridor and the communication signal fractured, and I sat back in my too small seat with my 2 long knees pressing against the seat back in front of me. And outside the window the stars were coming out one by one, cold and permanent and completely indifferent. 31 treaty signatories, 1 distress signal, mediation prayers, legal consultation, and 2 words from the humans. Stand by. I did not know what to do with 2 words. I sat with them for a long time, the way the Kelvhar we sit with everything, slowly, thoroughly, until the thing you are examining has been turned over in every direction and examined from every angle and allowed to settle into its final permanent shape. The words did not settle. They kept moving. I found that very strange. The ship hummed around me, 4,000 survivors breathed in the recycled air. Orvish had fallen into the light sleep of exhaustion beside me, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. The stars moved past the window, slow and indifferent. Stand by. I did not know what it meant. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 431 years, I was not sure Tuesday would come. The crack in the floor of Corridor 7 appeared on the 3rd day. I noticed it because I had started walking the corridors at night when the passenger bay lights dimmed and most of the 4,000 survivors slept, and the ship made its quiet, continuous sounds of effort. I had never been a person who walked for no reason. The Kelvhar we do not wander. We move from one purposeful location to another with intention and efficiency in Vathala. Wandering is a thing that happens when the mind cannot settle, and the Kelvhari mind, properly trained across centuries of deliberate practice, always settles. My mind was not settling. So I walked. Corridor 7 was one of the longer passages near the ship's midsection, a practical gray hallway lined with storage compartments and secondary life support panels. Nothing significant happened in Corridor 7. It was not designed to be significant. It was designed to connect 2 more important places efficiently. The crack ran across 3 floor tiles. A thin dark line, barely the width of my smallest finger, the kind of thing that happens to old ships, to any structure that has been under stress for long enough, the hull expanding and contracting in the temperature variations of deep transit, metal and Composite material doing what all materials do when pushed past what they were built to endure. I crouched down and looked at it. It was not large enough to be a safety concern. I know this because I spent the next 20 minutes checking the surrounding hull integrity data on the panel near the storage bay, and everything read within acceptable parameters. The crack was cosmetic, superficial. I looked at it anyway. I came back the next morning and looked at it again. Then the morning after that. By the 5th day, I was measuring it with my fingers, pressing the tips of 2 fingers into the floor on either side of the crack and then holding them up to see the span. 2 finger widths, not wider than the day before. I thought, approximately the Orvesh found me doing this once. He stood at the end of the corridor and watched me for a moment and did not say anything. He had a gift for useful silence. I appreciated it more than I would have been able to articulate. The ship had 19 days of food supplies when we left the surface. I knew this because the resource manifest had been filed as part of the emergency departure documentation, and I had processed it the way I processed everything, carefully and completely. 19 days of full rations for 4,000 people, plus a 7% buffer for calculation variance. By day 8, we were on reduced rations, and the question of where we were going had become urgent in a way that the passenger bay committee meetings were struggling to address. I attended every committee meeting. I sat at the table. I listened. I answered questions when I was asked questions. I made notes in my small notebook, which I had carried in my coat pocket when I left my office, and which had been with me ever since. The way certain small objects attach themselves to a person during a crisis without any deliberate decision being made. The questions at the committee meetings were always the same questions. Where are we going? How long can we survive? Who is coming to help us? I answered the first 2 as accurately as the available data permitted. The nearest neutral station was 31 transit days away. We did not have 31 days of food. We could reach a secondary position, an unmapped transit corridor, in 12 days, and from their attempt communication with the compact. For the third question, I had less precise information to offer. The Drell Consortium mediation team, as far as we could determine, had filed a formal request to open diplomatic dialogue with the Vihor and was awaiting a response through the proper channels. The Shenhari Collective had sent a follow-up message, more prayers. The Utari Mercantile legal team had clarified their position. They were watching the situation with great interest and wanted to ensure all parties understood the relevant treaty provisions. The Terran Compact had sent nothing further. I told the committee this. I told them that the human response had contained only 2 words and that there had been no update since. I watched the faces of the committee members as I said it. Some of them had the particular expression of people hearing what they already suspected. Some had the particular expression of people hearing what they had been hoping would not turn out to be true. Pilhar, a Kelhari elder who had been a university administrator before the evacuation and who had a gift for asking the most painful question in any room, looked at me across the table and asked if I believed the humans were coming. I said I did not know. She asked if I had reason to believe they were coming. I thought about 2 words, stand by. way they had refused to settle in my mind the way everything else had settled. I said I thought it was possible. She said that was not the same as yes. I said no, it was not the same as yes. The meeting continued. Resource. Projections, route calculations. A detailed discussion of the ship's water recycling capacity that reminded me uncomfortably of the filtration report I had left unfinished on my desk. After the meeting, I went back to Corridor 7. The crack was still there, 2-finger width, not wider, not smaller, just present the way certain facts are present, the kind you cannot file away into any category you have. I want to describe what those days were like, and I want to describe them accurately, which means I have to say that they were very quiet. That is the thing I remember most, not fear exactly, not despair exactly, quiet. The particular quality of quiet that exists when 4,000 people are each sitting with the same unspoken arithmetic running, the same calculations about food and days and distance, and nobody wants to be the one to say the numbers out loud. I had been in the Kelvhari administrative service for over 4 centuries. I had managed crises before. Supply disruptions, diplomatic failures, a catastrophic flood on the Meverin outpost that had required emergency resource reallocation across 11 departments and 12 weeks of round-the-clock coordination. I knew how to function inside a problem. I knew how to keep moving through difficulty because the work required it. This was different. This was not a problem with a procedure. This was not a crisis with a correct form to file and a maintenance bureau to contact and a 4 to 6 day response window to wait through. This was the space after procedure, the place where all the correct things had been done and the situation had not improved, and you were left sitting in a corridor at night measuring a crack in the floor with your fingers because your mind needed something to measure. On day 11, a young crew member named Petrov came to find me. He was perhaps 30 years old in terms of his species development, which made him very young indeed, and he had the particular energy of young crew members. Everywhere a barely contained physical restlessness, as though his body was continuously making suggestions about running that his mind was politely declining. He had been assigned to the communications relay station at the back of the ship, which meant he spent his days listening to signals from across the compact network and logging what he received. He came to find me in Corridor 7, which told me that Orvesh had told him where I went at night, which told me that people were starting to keep track of where I was, which told me more about the state of things than any resource report. He said he had something I should hear. I followed him to the communications relay station. He had saved the signal. He played it for me, turning up the receiver to its highest sensitivity because the signal was faint, carrying a long way on low power, fragmented by distance and interference. I listened. It was a human voice, a woman's voice, speaking quickly in the compact common language with the particular accent of someone who had grown up speaking something else first. The signal was broken, pieces were missing. What remained in order was this: fuel calculations are wrong, we go anyway. Then static, then very faint, barely audible through the interference. She said it doesn't matter what it costs. Then silence. Then clearest of all, as though this Part of the signal had traveled more cleanly than the rest, 37 hours. Them 37 hours. Petrov was watching my face the way Orvesh had watched it during the first hours, the way young people watch the faces of older people when the world has gone strange and they need to know how to calibrate their response. I asked him to play it again. He played it again. I listened to the woman's voice say, across a distance I could not fully calculate that the fuel calculations were wrong and they were going anyway. That it didn't matter what it cost, that she needed someone to tell us 37 hours. Tell them 37 hours. I did not know who she was. I did not know what she commanded or how many ships were behind her voice or what the 37 hours would bring at its end. I did not know if the fuel calculations being wrong meant the ships would not arrive. I did not know any of the relevant data. 37 hours. I stood in the communications relay station for a long time. Then something happened in my chest. Physical thing, a loosening of something I had not known was held tight. It arrived without warning, the way the orange sky had arrived without warning. Except that this was the opposite. This was not an ending arriving. This was something I did not have the correct Kalpachari word for, arriving in the body before the mind had time to process it. I made a sound. I had not planned to make a sound. It came out of me in a single short burst. Involuntary, startled out of me by the loosening thing in my chest, and it was not a sound I had made before in 431 years of life. Petrov jumped slightly in his seat. He looked at me with wide eyes. I realized the sound had been laughter. I had laughed. I had not laughed since before I could clearly remember. The Kalpachari expressed satisfaction, approval, measured amusement. We do not laugh. Laughter is a fast metabolizing species thing, an overflow of feeling too quick and too large to be held in, and the Kalpachari are built to hold things in, to sit with them, to let them settle. The feeling had not settled. It was still moving, the way those two words had kept moving, stand by and now. This 37 hours and something was building in me that had nowhere to go. That was too large for the containers I had been given, and my eyes were doing something they had never done before. Water. I stood in the communications relay station and my eyes produced water, and I looked at the receiver that had carried a woman's voice across an impossible distance to tell me that she was going anyway regardless of what the calculation said, and I could not stop the water from coming. Petrov did not say anything. He was, for all his youth and restlessness, a person who understood when silence was the correct response. He turned back to his console and gave me the room in the room, the private space inside a shared space that a person needs when something long held is finally and irrevocably released. After a while I wiped my face. I went back to the passenger bay. I found Orvesh, who was awake and sitting in the dim light with his notebook, and I sat down next to him. He looked at me. He saw my face. He did not ask questions. I told him 37 hours. He nodded once slowly, the way the Kalpachari nod with weight and permanence. I told him I did not know what was coming at the end of 37 hours. I told him I did not know how many ships, or what condition they would be in, or whether the fuel calculations being wrong was a small problem or a catastrophic one. I told him I had no data beyond Fragmented signal carrying a woman's voice across a very large distance. He asked me if I believed it. I thought about the crack in the floor of Corridor 7. I thought about what it meant to measure a thing every day and watch it hold, not growing, just present, something small that was still there. I said yes. He said good. Then he went back to his notebook, and I sat in the dim light of the passenger bay with 4,000 sleeping people breathing around me and the stars moving past the windows and 37 hours running down in the dark. I told the committee in the morning. I told them exactly what I knew and exactly what I did not know. I told them about the signal, the voice, the fuel calculations, the 37 hours. I laid it out with the same precision I would have used for any report, any data set, any budget cross-reference. Pelhor asked me who the woman was. I said I did not know. She asked me why the humans had waited this long to respond. I said I did not know that either. She asked me why a human fleet would come when 31 other treaty signatories had offered prayers and legal consultation. I did not have a good answer for that. I sat with the question the way I had sat with everything, slowly, carefully, from every angle. Eventually, I said that I thought perhaps the humans did not operate from the same calculation set that the rest of us used. That perhaps when the humans saw a problem, the first question they asked was not whether the numbers worked, but whether the thing was right, and that those were not always the same question, and that the distance between those two questions was possibly exactly the size of a Vihorn fleet standing between a human transit corridor and 4,000 survivors on reduced rations. Pelhard looked at me for a long time. Then she said she hoped I was right. So did I. I went to Corridor 7 that night. I measured the crack, 2-finger widths, unchanged, holding 22 hours left. I did not sleep. I sat in my seat in the passenger bay with my notebook in my lap, and I wrote nothing in it. I just held it. Some things you hold because the holding is the point. 19 hours. 12. 7. The crack in the tile was 2-finger widths wide, and it was not growing in. The ship hummed around me, and 4,000 people breathed in the recycled air, and somewhere out in the dark past the edge of every calculation that said it was not possible, something was coming. Anyway, I stopped measuring. The Vihorn fleet arrived at hour 31. 6 hours ahead of them. I was in the passenger bay when the proximity alert sounded, and I want to be clear about what that alert sounded like, because I think it is important. It was a 3-tone signal, ascending, designed to convey urgency without inducing the kind of sharp physical response that causes people to make poor decisions. It was a reasonable alert designed by reasonable people for reasonable emergencies. It was completely inadequate for the situation. The committee had been meeting in shifts, monitoring the communications array, tracking the transit corridor data, checking and rechecking the resource numbers, even though the numbers had stopped changing because there was nothing left to change. Petrov had been at the relay station for 14 hours without sleeping. Orvich had not left my side since I told him 37 hours, which meant he had also not slept, though he had managed to find food somewhere, because at one point he produced a container of something that passed for rations and pressed it into my hands without a word. When the proximity alert sounded, everyone looked at the communications array. The VHOR fleet appeared on the long-range sensor grid as a cluster of returns so dense they initially read as sensor interference. The grid was not designed to display that many ships simultaneously. It simply rendered them as a mass shape, a thing so large it registered more as weather than as individual vessels. I counted what I could distinguish. I stopped counting at 40. The committee was very quiet. Pelhor, who would ask the most painful questions in every meeting, and who I had come to think of as one of the most rigorous minds I had ever encountered in 4 centuries of council work, looked at the grid for a long time and then said very quietly that she wanted to formally revise her previous position. She said she did not think the humans were coming. The room was silent. She said this not with cruelty. She said it with the particular precision of a person who has been holding out hope and has decided that honesty serves better than hope when honesty is what remains. I looked at the grid. I looked at the massive returns that the sensor could not individually render. I thought about 37 hours. I thought about fuel calculations being wrong. I thought about a woman's voice traveling across an impossible distance to say, it doesn't matter what it costs. I did not revise my position. I said the human said 37 hours. We were at 31. We had 6 hours remaining. Pelhar said 6 hours was a long time. When a VHOR fleet had you in detection range. She was correct about that. The VHOR were not a species I had much direct experience with before all of this. They existed in my knowledge primarily as treaty context, as a name that appeared in the security provisions of compact agreements, as the reason certain border regions were designated restricted transit zones. They had a reputation. Every species has a reputation, and the VHOR's reputation was one of absolute unhurried certainty, which I would have found admirable in other circumstances. They did not hurry. They moved toward us with the patient, methodical precision of something that has never once needed to rush, because there had never once been any doubt about the outcome. The first communication from the VHOR fleet arrived at hour 32. It was addressed to the senior authority aboard our vessel, and it was written in perfect formal compact standard, which is the language of diplomacy and trade. And it turns out of being informed that resistance is unnecessary and that compliance will result in an expedient process. I read it. I filed it in my notebook under things that happened. Then I went to the communications array and opened every possible receive frequency, and I waited. At hour 33, Petra fell asleep at his station. He went down sideways in his chair, out completely, one hand still resting on the console. I left him there. He had earned it. At hour 34, a second communication arrived from the VHOR, this one more direct. At hour 35, Orvesh came to stand next to me at the array. He did not say anything, he just stood there. At hour 36, Pelhar came into the communications room and sat down in the chair nearest the door and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. She was one of the most formally composed individuals I had ever known in 4 centuries of public service. She looked in that moment extremely tired. I looked at the sensor grid. The VHOR fleet was close enough now that the individual ship returns were beginning to separate from the mass, beginning to render as distinct shapes. I could count them properly now. I counted. I stopped at 60. Hour 37. Nothing. I stood at the array and looked at the frequency display and listened to the enormous absolute silence of deep space, which is not actually a silence but a noise floor, a low persistent hiss that is the background radiation of the universe itself, and inside that hiss there was nothing from the direction the signal had come from. Petrov was asleep. Orvash was beside me. Pelhar was in the corner. 4,000 people were in the passenger bay, and the committee had stopped holding sessions because what was there left to cross-reference? Hour 37 and 20 minutes. The Viharan fleet was decelerating into intercept position. Orvash's hand found my arm. He did not grip it. He just placed it there, the Kalvhari gesture of accompaniment, the thing we do when we cannot fix the situation and want to mark that we are present in it. We had done this for each other at funerals, at the ends of long, difficult things, at partings. It was the oldest gesture we had. I put my hand over his. We stood there, and then the sensor grid did something I did not have an immediate explanation for. A section of it, not the section showing the Viharan fleet, but a completely different vector, a direction that contained nothing, that had contained nothing for every hour of this entire transit, simply filled with returns. Too many returns. The display did what it had done with the Viharan fleet. It could not resolve individual ships. It rendered them as a mass, as a shape, as something so large. It read as weather. Different weather. Coming very fast. I leaned forward and looked at the grid. In my mind, which is a 431-year-old Kalvhari mind built for deliberation and patience and the careful processing of information before conclusions are drawn, my mind looked at the vector and the mass and the speed and reached its conclusion in approximately 3 seconds. Humans. I had a thought then that I will record here because I think it is the most honest thing I have ever put in any document. My first thought was not relief. My first thought was that they were going to get here, and it was going to be terrible. My second thought, arriving almost simultaneously, was that they were going to get here. The communications array crackled. A signal came through on an emergency frequency strong enough that Petrov startled awake at his station and fumbled for the receiver. The signal was not fragmented. It was not faint. It was very loud and very clear, and it came from the center of the mass of returns that was moving toward us at a speed the grid's display was struggling to render accurately. The voice was the same woman's voice from the fragmented signal 11 days ago. She sounded exactly as she had sounded then, not frantic, not triumphant, simply direct, in the way of someone who has made all the decisions that needed making and is now executing them. She identified herself as commanding Officer Nina Asi of the Terran Compact Emergency Response Fleet. She identified our vessel by designation. She said that she had our position and that her fleet was at engagement range, and that we should hold course and not do anything that the Viharan might interpret as aggressive. Then she opened a second frequency. On that frequency, she contacted the Viharan fleet. She identified herself again, same name, same rank, same direct voice. She informed the Viharan fleet that they were in the process of engaging a vessel carrying civilian survivors who were under the protection of the Terran Compact for the Articles of the Mutual Defense Agreement, which she then cited by number and subclause in a way that suggested she had spent some portion of the 37 hours reading treaty documents. She said that if the Viharan fleet wished to proceed, the Terran Compact fleet would be required to respond, and that she wanted to give them this information now so that they could make an informed decision. The Viharan did not respond. She waited very patiently for 90 seconds. Then she said, and I wrote this down in my notebook as she said it, word for word, "You picked the wrong species to make orphans of." The transmission ended. For a moment there was nothing. Then the sensor grid showed the Terran fleet moving. What happened next is something I have struggled to describe accurately, and I want to describe it accurately because I believe it matters. I have read the technical assessment since I have looked at the engagement records. I understand in retrospect what the Terran fleet was and was not. They were not a superior force. They did not have better weapons or better shields or better technology. The sensor grid showed me 31 Terran ships against 60+ Viharan vessels, and those numbers do not resolve in favor of 31 by any military calculation I have ever encountered. They came anyway. 12 actual warships and 19 vessels that the records would later describe as modified civilian craft, ships that had cargo capacity where weapon systems should have been, ships that were reinforced in ways that suggested being hit rather than being designed to avoid being hit, ships crewed by people who were there not because military protocol placed them there, but because they had looked at the situation and decided that the correct response to it was to be present in it. They took damage, significant damage, early because they were outnumbered, and the Viharan were precise and experienced. 2 of the civilian vessels took hits in the first exchange that reduced their capability substantially. They did not stop. They reorganized, they redistributed. The damaged ships pulled back and the warships covered them, and then the warships pushed forward and the civilian vessels came around the other vector. And none of this was elegant, none of it was what military precision looks like. In the accounts I have read of other engagements, it was something else. It was the thing that happens when the calculation says it cannot be done, and someone decides the calculation is not the final authority. The Viharan are ancient. They have done this before. They have a methodology that has worked across 11 species, 11 civilizations, 11 sets of survivors who were put in a position of waiting to see what the correct and powerful would choose to do. What the Viharan did not have was any experience with a species that treats the word impossible as a suggested starting point rather than a conclusion. They fought for 4 hours. I watched the sensor grid. I do not have the language to describe watching 4 hours on a sensor grid while what was happening outside the hull of your ship was either the continuation of your existence or the end of it. The Kalahari sit with things, we process, we remain composed. I sat with this and processed it, and what I felt across 4 hours was something for which the Kalahari language is almost entirely unprepared. The Viharan fleet changed course. Not retreat, the records would note. Later, not defeat, recalculation. They had done their arithmetic, and the arithmetic had produced an unexpected variable, and they had updated their projections accordingly. They would be back. Everyone in that passenger bay understood they would be back. But not today. Today they turned and moved away with that same patient, unhurried precision. And the sensor grid showed them going. And the communications array was briefly full of human voices. Fragmented bursts of communication between the Terran ships, and I could not follow all of it. But I caught words here and there. Damage assessments and position confirmations, and once, very clearly, someone laughing. The same involuntary overflow I had experienced 11 days ago in the relay station. Someone on one of those ships, after 4 hours of that, was laughing. I wrote it down. Nina O's came back on the primary frequency. She said our fleet was moving into escort formation. She said she was sending a docking crew to assist with the transfer of survivors to the larger Terran vessel, which had more adequate facilities and more than enough food for all 4,000 of us, plus everyone who had come to get us. She said the transfer would begin in approximately 40 minutes. She said she was glad we were all right. Those were her exact words. I am glad you are all right. I turned to Orvesh, who had tears on his face, which I understood now because I had learned the word for it 11 days ago in the relay station. He looked at me and I looked at him, and for a long time neither of us said anything. Pelhar, from her chair by the door, said in a very quiet voice that she would like to formally revise her position a second time. I said that seemed reasonable. 40 minutes later, the docking arms of the Terran flagship extended toward our vessel. I walked to the airlock. I walked because the Kelvhari walk, because there is something in me that cannot be entirely removed by any amount of catastrophe, a slowness that is also a kind of stubbornness, a refusal to be rushed out of what I am. The airlock opened. On the other side stood a young woman, perhaps 25 years old. She had dark engine grease on the left side of her face, and her hair was pulled back in. She was eating something from a foil wrapper. She was wearing a Terran Fleet technical crew uniform that was not entirely clean, and she looked at me with a direct, unguarded assessment of someone who was too tired to be anything other than honest. She looked at my face. She saw, I think, 431 years of things on it. She said, "Hey, you okay?" 2 words. I stood in the airlock of a ship that had come from a distance that the fuel calculation said was not survivable. Crude snorts by people who had decided the calculations were not in charge, and this young woman with engine grease on her face looked at me and asked, present tense right now this second, whether I was okay. Not what did you lose, not what happened, not a formal expression of solidarity or a diplomatic acknowledgement of circumstances or a prayer or a legal clarification, just, "Are you okay now this moment, you?" I said no. She nodded as though that was exactly the right answer, the one she had expected, the only honest one available. She broke her food in half and held out the half she was not eating. I did not know what to do with it. I took it anyway. I held it in my hand, this piece of food, from a woman whose name I did not yet know, on a ship that should not have been here, and I walked through the airlock into the corridors of the Terran flagship, and behind me 4,000 Kelhari Survivors followed, walking slowly as we always walk, unhurried and permanent and still somehow here. I gave the address to the Galactic Compact Assembly on a morning in late spring, 1 year and 4 months after docking. The assembly hall on the station at Havelson Point is a significant structure. It was designed to impress, which it accomplishes through scale. The ceiling is high enough that the upper galleries are often in a slight atmospheric haze, and the seating descends toward the central speaking floor in wide concentric arcs, each level occupied by the delegations of member species in their formal arrangements, their flags and designating colors, and the various postures and physical attitudes with which each species signals attentiveness. 1,000 delegates, give or take the full assembly. It had not convened at this size for some years. I stood at the central speaking floor with my notebook in my hands and looked up at them. I had spent 3 weeks writing the address. I had produced 7 complete drafts, each more polished than the last, each more precisely calibrated to the formal registers of compact diplomatic language, each more carefully constructed to make the argument that I had been asked to make. The Kelfar Provisional Government wanted formal recognition of the Terran Compact's elevated status. They wanted the Mutual Defense Agreement revised to include enforceable response provisions. They wanted the record to reflect what had happened and what had not happened, and what the difference between those 2 things had cost. These were the right things to want. The argument for them was solid. I had made it across 7 drafts, and it was airtight. I looked at 1,000 delegates, and I put my 7th draft on the lectern, and I did not read from it. I told them about the crack in the floor of Corridor 7. I told them about the grain report I had been filing when the window turned the wrong color. I told them about Vithela, the virtue of unhurried certainty, and what it had built and what it had cost. I told them about 31 responses to a distress signal, and I named each response by category, not by species, because this was not about nomming. It was about understanding what we had collectively decided the Mutual Defense Agreement meant in practice when practice arrived. I told them about 2 words: stand by. And then I told them about what standing by actually looked like. I told them about Nina Ase, though had met her only briefly by then, because she was not someone who stayed long in any one place. She had visited the provisional settlement on our temporary world twice. The first time she stayed for 1 day and spent most of it in meetings about resource needs. The second time she brought a team of engineers to help with water filtration system design, because someone had apparently told her we had a long-standing issue with water filtration, and she arrived with 3 engineers and 2 days of plans, and she was gone before I could properly think. Sorry. I told the assembly about fuel calculations. I told them that the official record, which I had read in its entirety, noted that the Terran fleet had departed on supplies projected at 61% of what the transit required, and that the technical solution to this problem had been a combination of ration reduction, engine modification performed in transit, and what the fleet engineers report described as creative redefinition of the acceptable risk threshold. Creative redefinition. I had read that phrase many times. I had sat with it the way I sit with Everything, I had turned it over and looked at it from every angle. A creative redefinition of the acceptable risk threshold. What that meant was that 31 ships full of people had looked at the numbers, determined that the numbers said no, and then had a conversation about whether the numbers were in charge, and they had decided collectively that the numbers were a factor but not the authority. And they had gone. I told the assembly this, and then I stopped reading from my notes entirely. I looked out at 1,000 delegates. I said we had every reason, we had documentation, we had precedent, treaty and cause, we did everything correctly, we filed every form. We sent every signal at the appropriate time. Through the appropriate channels, we followed the procedure that procedure required. The correct people offered their condolences. I paused. The hall was very quiet. I said the humans showed up. I did not say it loudly, I did not perform it, I said it the way I say most things, in the deliberate measured voice of a Kelfhari administrator who has spent 4 centuries choosing words with care. I said it and let it sit in the room. Then I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a small folded piece of foil, the wrapper from the food that the young engineer had broken in half and given me in the airlock on the day of the transfer. I had not thrown it away. I had carried it from the ship to the settlement and then to the address preparations and now here to the speaking floor of the Galactic Compact Assembly, where I had intended to deliver 7 polished drafts of a formal diplomatic argument. I held it up. I said, I do not have a philosophy to offer you, I have a protocol to recommend and a treaty revision to present, and the full supporting documentation is available through standard compact channels, and my office will respond to all inquiries within the standard 4 to 6 day window. A ripple of sound through the hall, not laughter exactly, the thing adjacent to laughter that happens when something honest lands. I said, and I have this, a protein bar wrapper I have not thrown away. I said, I don't know why. I said, figure that out. We have work to do. I sat down. The hall was quiet for longer than halls are usually quiet after formal addresses. To the Galactic Compact Assembly, long enough that I became aware of individual sounds within the quiet, the atmospheric systems, the faint ambient noise of 1,000 people breathing, a small sound from the 3rd row of the lower gallery, where the Terran delegation was seated, which was the sound of someone crying. I recognized what it was. I had not known, 1 year and 4 months ago, in a relay station on a ship with 19 days of food, that I had anything in common with the fast metabolizing species who would come to find me. I had not known what laughter was for practical purposes. I had not known what it meant to feel something too large for the containers available. I knew now. I had learned the word. The young engineer's name I had found out 3 weeks after the transfer was Clara Webb. She was 23 years old. She was from a place called Manchester, which is a city on a planet I had never visited. She had been assigned to the Terran Fleet's engineering crew 4 days before departure because they were short-staffed, and she had the right certifications, and she had, according to her service record, simply said yes when asked. Just yes. The way you say yes to a thing when you have decided that the thing is right and the calculation is not the final authority. I had written her a letter, a formal Letter by Kelvhari Standards, which means it was long and carefully worded, and expressed its gratitude in complete sentences with proper subordinate clauses. I had spent 2 days on it. She had written back in 3 lines. She said she was glad they made it in time. She said she hoped the new settlement was coming along well. She said if we ever needed engineers, she knew some good ones. 3 lines. I had read those 3 lines more times than I had read most of the 7 drafts of the Assembly address. The thing about the Kelvhari is that we understand weight, we understand that time has mass, that history accumulates, that the slow, careful work of centuries builds something real and permanent and worth preserving. We understand all of this. We have built civilizations on it. What we had not understood, and what I was beginning slowly in my deliberate and unhurried way to understand, was that there is a different kind of weight. The weight of the present moment, the weight of right now, the weight of a question asked without qualification about whether you specifically are okay this second, not in the context of history or loss or the full scope of what has happened, but just right now. Are you okay? The Kelvhari language does not have a word for that question. We have words for well-being, for stability, for the condition of being in a satisfactory state relative to long-term indicators. We do not have a word for the stripped-down immediate version of the question, the 2-word version, the version that does not ask about the past or the future but just looks at your face and wants to know about right now. I was learning to have a word for it. The Assembly had begun its response proceedings. Delegates were requesting the floor. The formal machinery of the compact was moving as it always moves, with deliberation and procedure and the slow accumulation of consensus. I sat in my chair on the speaking floor and listened to it and felt for the first time in a very long time patient. Not the patience of someone waiting for the correct process to deliver the correct outcome, because that is how things have always worked. A different patience, the patience of someone who has seen what happens when the process fails and someone decides to come anyway. I reached into my pocket and turned the foil wrapper over in my fingers. Outside the hall's observation windows, the stars were doing what they always do, cold and permanent, and I had come to suspect not entirely indifferent, just very far away, which it turned out was not the same thing as too far away. Not for everyone. Pelhor had asked me in the ship's committee room on the 8th day why I believed the humans were coming. I had not had a good answer then. I had said something about different calculation sets, about the question of what is right being separate from the question of what the numbers allow. I had a better answer now. I believe they were coming because they said stand by, and stand by in the human language does not mean wait to see what we decide. It means we are already deciding. It means the only question still open is the logistics. I believe they were coming because the fuel calculations were wrong and they went anyway. I believe they were coming because a woman named Nina Osai looked at 60 plus warships and 11 orphan species and decided that you picked the wrong species to make orphans of and meant it. I believe they were coming because 23-year-old Clara Webb from Manchester said yes when someone asked if she could go, and then broke a protein bar in half for a 431-year-old alien administrator. She had never met who was standing in an airlock looking like all the weight of everything that had ended was sitting on him. Are you okay? I had said no. She had nodded like that was honest and therefore acceptable, and handed me half of what she had. That, I think, is the whole of it. That is the thing I have been trying to find the correct report format for. Across 1 year and 4 months of provisional settlement meetings and treaty revision proposals and formal diplomatic correspondence and 7 drafts of an address I did not end up reading. It is not complicated. It does not require a philosophy. It requires a person who looks at you and asks present tense right now whether you are okay, and then does something about the answer. The assembly voted eventually. The treaty revisions passed. The Terran Compact status was formally elevated with enforceable mutual defense provisions, response time requirements, and a new subclause that several older member species found uncomfortably specific, but which the majority carried. Nina Oz attended the signing ceremony. She stood in the back of the hall in her fleet uniform, and she was not in any of the official photographs because she moved out of frame before each one was taken, which I was told was completely characteristic of her. I shook her hand after a human gesture, which the Kelvhari do not have exactly, but which I had been practicing. She shook back with a firm, brief grip of someone who has many things to do. I told her I had something of hers. I gave her the foil wrapper. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at me. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth that I now knew was the precursor to a smile. That slight movement before the full expression arrives. She said that was Clara's, not hers. I said I knew. But Clara had gotten my letter and written back in 3 lines, which was wonderful, and I thought someone should hold on to this in the meantime. Nina Oz looked at the foil wrapper in her hand. She looked at me. She said, okay. She put it in her pocket. She walked away to the next thing that needed doing, which is, I have come to understand, simply what she does. The crack in the floor of corridor 7, according to the ship's maintenance records filed after the transfer, was noted in the assessment as minor cosmetic damage requiring no immediate repair. Standard wear consistent with transit. Stress acceptable within operational parameters. I had the maintenance report sent to my office. I have it in a folder. I look at it sometimes. Some things you hold because the holding is the point, because what they mean is not the thing you can put in any report or any address or any treaty revision, no matter how many drafts you write. What they mean is that the crack held. The ship held. The 37 hours ended, and something came out of the dark that had no business being there, and was there anyway. And somewhere in the universe, a woman with engine grease on her face and half a protein bar is asking someone right now this second whether they are okay. And someone is saying no. And she is nodding like that is the right answer and handing over half of what she has. That is the whole of it. That is everything.